Imagine being on the run for over a decade, hiding in plain sight, and never getting caught. Sounds like something straight out of a crime thriller, right? Well, it's not fiction. It's the wild story of Russell Cox, a man who escaped one of Australia's most secure prisons and then lived as a fugitive for years. From armed robberies to near misses with the police, Cox became a living legend in the criminal world. But what's even crazier, he managed to blend in with everyday life while staying one step ahead of the law. So, how did he pull it off? Stick around to hear the incredible details of his daring escapes, his time on the run, and how his story ended in ways you'd never expect. Russell Cox wasn't just your average criminal. In fact, calling him a criminal doesn't really do him justice. He was more like a ghost, a shapeshifter, a man who could slip through the cracks of the law and disappear without leaving a trace. Born in the early 1950s in Melbourne, Australia, Russell Cox's journey into the criminal world didn't follow the usual path. He wasn't born into a life of crime, but life had a funny way of pushing him in that direction. By the time he hit his teens, Cox was no stranger to trouble. He started small, petty thefts here and there, but his criminal career quickly escalated. It wasn't long before he became known for more serious offenses like armed robbery. But even as he got more involved in the world of crime, there was something different about him. He wasn't just focused on stealing. Russell Cox had a unique obsession: escaping. Imagine being a criminal who doesn't just rob banks or break into places, but also has an insane talent for disappearing after committing the crime. That was Russell Cox. He had this almost supernatural ability to escape from any situation. And it wasn't long before he made a name for himself as one of the best escape artists the criminal world had ever seen. But it wasn't just luck. It wasn't just a chance. Cox had a cleverness that set him apart from the rest. It was like he was playing a game where the stakes were high, and every move he made was calculated. And he loved it. At the age of 26, he was already doing time for armed robbery. And it was during his stint in Long Bay Jail, Sydney, that he started to really hone his escape skills. Long Bay was supposed to be one of the most secure jails in Australia, basically the place where prisoners who were deemed too dangerous to be held anywhere else were sent. But Cox had other ideas. In 1977, he did something that made headlines across the country. He pulled off an escape from the so-called escape-proof Long Bay Jail. No one saw it coming, not even the guards who were convinced no one could break out of that place. This wasn't just some lucky run. This was Russell Cox proving once again that he was no ordinary criminal. He knew how to read situations, how to plan and execute an escape like a pro. What's even crazier, after this dramatic escape, Cox went on the run for years. For 11 years, no one could catch him, and he used that time wisely. He didn't just hide out in some dingy basement or some remote shack in the woods. No, Cox lived a life that blended in with the crowd. He wasn't just a criminal on the run, he was a ghost, and he wasn't going down without a fight. During those 11 years, Cox wasn't holed up in a dark corner somewhere. He had a girlfriend, a partner in crime, Helen Dean. They lived in plain sight in Mount Martha, a quiet suburb in Melbourne. The fact that they managed to live like this while being one of Australia's most wanted criminals is mind-blowing. But, as we'll see later, Cox's ability to blend in was one of the things that made him so dangerous. It's like he had this superpower that allowed him to disappear into the everyday world without anyone noticing. Of course, he wasn't just lying low. No, Russell Cox didn't take a break from his criminal life. During those 11 years, he was still out there, committing robberies, causing chaos, and living life like he had nothing to lose. He was clever, meticulous, and always one step ahead of the authorities. And even when things seemed like they were about to catch up with him, Cox somehow found a way to slip through the net. He was a master of disguise, able to change his appearance at will, whether it was wearing a wig, changing his hairstyle, or using theatrical makeup. He could transform himself into a completely different person, making it nearly impossible for anyone to track him down. But, of course, no one can stay hidden forever, and while Cox was smart and careful, he couldn't outrun everything. His past eventually caught up with him. But by the time it did, Russell Cox had become more than just a criminal. He had become a legend. Russell Cox was no ordinary criminal. Not only was he a master escape artist, but he also had an insane talent for blending in. This wasn't just luck. This was a man who knew exactly how to stay one step ahead of the law. And how did he do that, you ask? Well, one of the biggest tricks in his playbook was his ability to disguise himself. Now, when we talk about disguises, we're not talking about just throwing on a cheap mask or a dodgy wig. No, Cox was a real pro when it came to changing his appearance. He understood that looking different could be the difference between being caught and staying free. And boy, did he go all in on this. Take a look at the stash of materials found at a hideout in Mount Martha after the whole Ian Carroll incident. It was like something out of a Hollywood spy movie. Police found wigs, makeup, even theatrical cosmetics. The man was ready for anything, whether it was dyeing his hair, wearing wigs, or even putting on a fake mustache. Cox had perfected the art of looking like someone else. But here's where it gets wild. He didn't just change his look, he would also change his weight. You know, one minute he'd bulk up a bit, the next he'd slim down. It was like Cox had cracked the code for becoming a totally different person on a whim. No wonder he managed to evade capture for so long. And let's be real, if you saw him out on the street jogging past you, would you really notice it was Australia's most wanted man? Probably not. That's how good he was at blending in. Even when he was walking around the streets of Melbourne, doing his regular morning jog, no one suspected a thing. People saw him as just another guy getting his exercise in, not the dangerous criminal who'd escaped from one of the most secure prisons in the country. You could even hear people talking about him in the coffee shops, without realizing they were talking about one of the most elusive fugitives in Australian history. The locals would chat about Cox, or the Mad Dog, as they called him, and they had no clue they were discussing the very person they were unknowingly walking past every day. It's crazy to think about. Someone so dangerous, so well-known, living right under people's noses, and nobody had a clue. But what makes it all the more fascinating is that Cox didn't just change his appearance for fun. It was about control. You see, for someone like Cox, who lived in constant fear of being caught, the ability to change his identity was power. He wasn't just trying to escape the police, he was outsmarting them, showing them that he was always ahead of the game. It fed into his ego. Every time he pulled off a successful disguise, it was like a win in his book. Forensic psychologist Bob Montgomery said that Cox's ability to disguise himself wasn't just about escaping the law, but about reinforcing a deeper part of his personality, his grandiosity. He loved proving how clever he was. To him, the disguise wasn't about hiding his true self. It was about showing off his skills. Look at me, I'm so smart I can fool anyone. That was Cox's mindset. It was like playing chess with the entire police force, and he was always a few moves ahead. Of course, to some people, disguises are just a way to survive. Take makeup, for instance. Makeup doesn't change who you are at your core. It just gives you more options. It allows you to play with different versions of yourself. For Cox, disguises gave him freedom. They allowed him to live a relatively normal life while hiding in plain sight. He wasn't trapped by his past. With every new look, he could walk into a room, unnoticed, and get away with things that most criminals could only dream of. But let's not sugarcoat it. As much as disguises gave him options, they also fed his dangerous side. The more he used them, the more powerful he felt. The more he got away with, the more confident he became. And as much as he changed on the outside, there was one thing that stayed the same: his sense of control and the pride he took in fooling the system. And here's the twist. While he was out there, evading the law, getting away with robbery after robbery, Cox wasn't exactly isolated. He was part of Melbourne's criminal elite. He didn't work alone. In fact, he had connections that kept his criminal empire going. He had a partner, Helen Dean, who was as involved in his schemes as he was. It was like they were playing a game together, with Cox always in the driver's seat. As much as he had a brilliant knack for evading capture, Cox also had a tendency to stir things up. And when his life collided with another notorious criminal, things took a deadly turn. He wasn't just evading the law and committing robberies. Things got seriously deadly when he crossed paths with one of Melbourne's most notorious criminals, Ian Carroll. In 1983, Cox found himself at a house in Mount Martha, a quiet suburb near Melbourne. On the surface, it might have looked like just another hideout, but this place had a dark history. The house was owned by Ian Carroll, a former armed robber and dangerous criminal in his own right. The two men, both at the top of their game in the criminal world, had a rather volatile relationship. They were tied through connections, and both were heavily involved in the world of armed robbery. But things were about to take a fatal turn. Cox and Carroll didn't just have a professional relationship, they had a personal one too. But, as with many criminal partnerships, it was a relationship filled with tension, jealousy, and power struggles. At some point, the two men had a major falling out. The details are a bit murky, but what we know is that it ended in a bloody showdown. On that fateful day in 1983, Cox and Carroll got into an argument that escalated quickly. The argument turned into a full-on shootout, with both men pulling guns on each other. Cox ended up being shot in the thigh, a painful wound that could have easily slowed him down. But, being the survivor he was, Cox didn't let it stop him. What happened next was as shocking as it was brutal. Cox shot and killed Ian Carroll. The police investigation that followed was intense. They searched the house and found a massive stash of weapons, a huge cache of firearms, including handguns, assault rifles, submachine guns, and even shotguns. And that's not all. They also uncovered tools and equipment that any armed robber would love to have on hand. Balaclavas, security guard uniforms, safes, you name it. It looked like Cox and Carroll had been planning their next big job together, but things went horribly wrong. To make things even more intriguing, the house was filled with some pretty peculiar stuff. Along with the weapons and robber tools, the police found printed materials on disguises, wigs, and theatrical cosmetics. It was clear that Cox had been preparing for something bigger, something more daring. And the police found all of this just after the bloody shootout. Talk about a treasure trove for law enforcement. But the mystery didn't stop there. Despite being shot in the leg and barely able to stand, Cox didn't show any signs of slowing down. In fact, it seems like he went into survival mode, escaping from the scene of the crime and disappearing back into the shadows. It's one of those moments that highlights just how dangerous and determined Cox was. There's also the part where Cox's partner, Helen Dean, played a vital role in helping him. She wasn't just there for emotional support. She was hands-on, literally saving his life. Helen Dean, who was a trained nurse, helped Cox recover from his gunshot wound. It's said that she even removed the bullet from his leg, using her nursing skills to keep him alive and well enough to keep running. It's one of those details that makes you realize just how close they were, not just in love, but in crime too. But here's the thing. Despite all this evidence of his involvement in the killing of Ian Carroll, Cox never faced a murder trial. Why? Because there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with the murder. It was a classic case of he said, she said. The police couldn't prove who shot first, so the case against him for murder was dismissed. That didn't stop Cox from facing more legal trouble, though. After everything settled down, he was charged with a string of armed robberies that he had committed over the years, and the time was ticking on his eventual capture. But for now, his criminal reign was far from over. What makes this chapter so chilling is just how ruthless and unpredictable Cox was. He didn't think twice about taking someone's life, especially if he felt it was necessary for his survival. It was a brutal reminder that, even though he was a master at disguising himself and staying out of sight, he was also capable of extreme violence when the stakes were high. But Cox was far from being done with his life of crime. If there's one thing that Russell Cox is known for, it's his ability to escape. And we're not talking about just any ordinary escape here. We're talking about breaking out of one of the most high-security prisons in Australia. In fact, his escape from Long Bay Jail in 1977 still stands as one of the most audacious and daring prison breaks in Australian history. Let's set the scene. Long Bay Jail was known for being escape-proof. Built to house some of the most dangerous criminals in Australia, it was supposed to be a place where no one could get out. But then came Cox, and suddenly the word escape-proof didn't mean what it was supposed to. It became clear that if anyone could break out of this fortress, it would be him. And that's exactly what he did. Cox didn't rely on brute force or violent confrontations like many other escapees. No, his method was far more devious and intelligent. He was a master at reading the situation, observing every small detail, and then making his move when no one was expecting it. And that's exactly what he did. The details of his escape are a bit hazy, but the result was undeniable. Cox got out, just like that. Gone. The authorities were left scrambling, not knowing how he did it or where he had gone. He slipped through their fingers like a ghost. Now, let's talk about just how clever this guy was. Cox didn't just escape once. He had a history of pulling off impossible getaways. In fact, he had escaped from prisons before, but nothing compared to the Long Bay jailbreak. It was almost as if Cox had an innate ability to read people and situations, using that to his advantage to get away with his crimes. He wasn't just some run-of-the-mill criminal, he was a criminal mastermind, and his ability to outwit the authorities was part of what made him so dangerous. But even though Cox managed to slip away once again, he didn't get far. This time, his reign on the run wouldn't last forever. While he was still causing chaos, robbing banks, and carrying out other criminal activities, the law was slowly catching up to him. His escape might have been legendary, but eventually, luck runs out. And this time, it did. Cox got unexpected assistance when committing crimes. Helen Dean, his partner, supported him throughout. This woman shared Cox's dedication. She was involved in Cox's escapes and lifestyle, as well as his recovery after Ian Carroll shot him. She removed the bullet from his leg. It was a movie-style crime family. Together, they lived on the run, moving, hiding, and outpacing the cops. Though thrilling, life was never sure to last. Despite his efforts to stay hidden, the cops were always after him. They needed the right break, and 1988 provided it. Cox didn't die easily. Next phase in this wild adventure would end his reign of terror, but not without a battle. Will Cox be caught, or would his escape skills save him again? Cox didn't settle down after his Long Bay jail breakout. He was not a laid-back person. Instead, he increased his evasion, slipping through the cracks for years. He was distinguished from other criminals by his exceptional ability to modify his look, which he perfected over time. Not only did he look different, his identity changed. Cox was a master of disguise, dyeing his hair, donning wigs, changing his weight, and growing a beard. Not only for show, these skills helped him disappear for years, frequently under police radar. He seemed to have an invisible cloak that made him uncatchable. Imagine seeing an ordinary-looking guy jogging down the street and not suspecting anything. It was Russell Cox. Even bright investigators had trouble detecting him, since he blended in. This was more than vanity. Cox was trying to survive, not impress. His disguises and appearance changes were survival tactics, all part of his well-planned strategy to outwit the authorities. This showcased his diabolical ingenuity. Cox was no daft crook. His strategic intellect allowed him to manage his environment. Perception was everything in crime, he knew. Controlling how others saw him would let him control the story. He created these new identities to hide in the deadly world of crime. Forensic psychologist Bob Montgomery, who examined Cox extensively, said his ability to conceal himself was about bolstering his own vanity. Cox was more than evading justice. He won a game. Power, control, and outwitting everyone who thought he could catch him were the goals. He wanted to show the world how smart he was, not be fearful. Running and hiding wasn't the only thing. Cox had a personal life, as well as a criminal genius on the run. He and Helen Dean lived in a suburban Mount Martha, Melbourne home. Initially, everything seemed fine. Cox lived a rather normal life despite his criminal activity. Cox fought Ian Carroll, an armed robber who was meant to be his friend in this house. In criminal circles, things went south quickly. A fight ended in a shootout that left Cox with a leg wound. This wasn't his end, though. Cox repaired himself and kept moving with Helen's nursing help. While slowing him down, the bullet did not stop him. In reality, Cox wasted little time. He went back to running the streets a day after being shot. The kicker? No one knew. Though the cops were still after him, he appeared to be just another runner. The capacity to blend in and be everywhere and nowhere was crucial to Cox's plan. He wasn't hiding. He was living a normal life, almost if his history of crime and evasion was over. Of course, it was never that easy. When Cox thought he was safe, the police were always around. They were learning, adjusting, and approaching him. Cox avoided detection for years. The police searched for him hard, but he blended into society like a shadow. Even the smartest criminals fail, despite their cleverness and concealment. After over a decade on the run, Cox's time came in 1988. Naturally, he was seized in the most unexpected way. He did his most daring actions in Doncaster Shopping Town's parking lot in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. Cox and his loyal accomplice Raymond Denning, another legendary armed robber and escapee, planned to steal a substantial payroll delivery. The setup was flawless, but Cox didn't expect an extremely vigilant security guy. The guards saw the two men acting suspiciously and phoned the police, who responded fully. Denning stepped out of the car with his hands up when he realized the jig was up. Cox refused to surrender. He tried to flee by driving directly at the police. Police then opened fire on the car, shooting it like a movie. Even the driver, Cox, tried to flee, but his luck ran out. He lost control after bullets damaged his automobile. Russell Cox was apprehended after 11 years when he hit a brick wall. Officers initially had no idea who they had apprehended. They didn't realize they held Australia's most sought man. When Cox was removed from the car, he made sure they knew who they had. "You blokes won't believe who you've caught today," stated. Suddenly, the man who had eluded the law for nearly a decade was in custody. Police were shocked by Cox's capture and how readily he hid for so long. They had no idea that the innocent jogger they had seen going down the street for years was Australia's most sought criminal. The following days were full of surprises. The authorities discovered Cox's disguises, escapes, and near misses after his detention. His arrest was a fluke, but the cops were thrilled. Cox was finally captured after his spectacular escape. Despite police joy, the narrative continued. The press surrounded the story, screaming about the man who had deceived the system for so long. Despite his criminal record, Cox wouldn't go quietly. One charge, the murder of Ian Carroll, was dropped from his armed robbery charges. He was acquitted of murder because there was insufficient evidence. Cox's partner, Helen Dean, was unlucky. Being found outside the courtroom with a pen pistol in her handbag led to her arrest. That small stunt got her 6 months in prison. What about Cox? After years on the run, escapes, and near misses, how would he handle prison? Revert to his old ways? Did he finally change? Cox kept surprising people. The ultimate escape artist, the fugitive who never got caught, would now face prison. Cox's story would continue, as we'll see. He may have found atonement there. Many anticipated Cox to revert after his arrest. He had spent almost a decade eluding police, escaping capture, and committing high-stakes robberies. He wouldn't be controlled by prison, right? Russell Cox delivered more than expected. He served 16 additional years in prison in Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales. The surprising part is that while many expected Cox to cause havoc, something remarkable transpired. He thrived in prison, surprising everyone. Prison officials dubbed him a model prisoner. Cox contemplated his life and choices despite his past. He actively participated in programs to prevent young offenders from becoming criminals. Cox tried to show disturbed youth a new route instead of fueling the criminal environment. The goal wasn't merely rehabilitation for others. Cox appeared to be redeeming himself. He mentored younger offenders, encouraging them to ponder their futures and the life they could establish with alternate choices. He said in interviews that he didn't want others to follow his disastrous path. "Why would you choose to live like this?" he asked a teenage inmate. "It's not life. You always worry for your survival." Cox stood out for his self-awareness and willingness to serve others, which many saw as a difference. He wasn't the same guy who planned escapes or robberies. He understood the implications of his conduct and was trying to make atonement. Cox changed by 2004 when he came due for parole. Following his participation in these prison programs and hearing from witnesses to his turnaround, the parole board granted him parole. Prisoner Russell Cox was released on December 8, 2004. However, his story continued. After a release like that, Russell Cox became an enigma, defying expectations. He married Helen Dean, his lifelong partner. They had been through a lot, and now that he was free, he seemed to have found stability. Of course, there were obstacles. Cox had lied, escaped, and feared capture his whole life. The former escape artist now lived a normal life. He worked as a builder's laborer and cleaner to avoid crime. His famous escapologist escape from Katingal jail was perhaps the most stunning twist. Ironically, the authorities discovered that they had failed to properly create Katingal as a prison, thus they couldn't punish Cox for escape. Technicality alert. Russell Cox's narrative is about crime, punishment, forgiveness, transformation, and the potential of change, no matter how far gone you are. After evading authorities for almost a decade and living in disguise, the man tried to give back to society in the most meaningful way he could by aiding others who had fallen into the same traps he did. After all the escapes, robberies, and close calls, Cox lived a simpler but probably most meaningful life. He learned from his mistakes. In the end, his legacy was about finding a path out of his history, not just escaping anything.